The cargo pod screamed through the atmosphere like a dying comet, trailing smoke and debris across an alien sky. Owen gripped the emergency handles as the world spun outside his viewport, trees and mountains blurring into streaks of green and gray. The impact knocked the air from his lungs and rattled his bones, but the pod systems had done their job. He was alive. Silence followed the crash. Owen sat in the crumpled remains of his escape pod, breathing hard, checking himself for serious injuries. His left arm throbbed where it had slammed against the restraints, and his head felt like someone had used it as a drum, but nothing seemed broken. The pod's emergency beacon blinked red instead of green. Damaged. Of course it was damaged. He pushed open the hatch and stumbled into a forest unlike anything he had seen on Earth. The trees stretched hundreds of feet overhead, their bark shimmering with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed like slow heartbeats. The air tasted clean but strange, carrying scents he couldn't name. Owen pulled his survival pack from the pod and began setting up a basic camp in the clearing his crash had created 2 hours past. He had managed to construct a decent shelter using salvage panels from the pod and was attempting to coax the beacon into working when he heard it. A sound like thunder rolling across the sky, but rhythmic, deliberate. Owen looked up and felt his stomach drop. Wings. Massive wings cutting through the canopy, each beat sending leaves spiraling down around him. Not one pair. Many .7 creatures emerged from the forest, and Owen's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Dragons. There was no other word for them. Each one stood as tall as an earth elephant, with scales that ranged from deep forest green to stormy gray. Their eyes gleamed with unmistakable intelligence as they formed a circle around him, cutting off any escape route. Owen forced himself to remain still. Running would be pointless. Fighting would be suicide. He kept his hands visible and empty, his breathing steady despite the fear hammering in his chest. The largest dragon stepped forward, its hide covered in old scars that told stories of countless battles. It lowered its head to Owen's level, nostrils flaring as it scented him. Then it made a sound, a deep, rumbling growl that carried meaning even without translation. The other dragons responded, their voices overlapping in what sounded like an argument. Owen understood the situation perfectly even without speaking their language. They were deciding whether he was a threat or simply dinner that he stayed motionless, watching their body language. The scarred one seemed to be advocating for something aggressive, based on how it kept glancing at him and snapping its jaws. A few others appeared uncertain, shifting their weight and tilting their heads. One dragon, smaller than the rest with lighter green scales, kept looking at him with what almost seemed like curiosity. The debate continued for several minutes. Owen's legs began to ache from standing so still, but he didn't dare move. Then he heard something else. A different sound cutting through the deep voices of the adult dragons, that a chirp, high-pitched and insistent. The circle of dragons suddenly went silent. They turned as one, looking behind them, and Owen saw something small pushing through the gap between two massive legs that a dragon hatchling emerged, barely the size of a house cat. Its scales were a pale silver that seemed too dull compared to the vibrant colors of the adults. It was thin, almost fragile-looking, with oversized wings that dragged slightly on the ground. But it moved with absolute determination, marching straight toward Owen without any hesitation. The adult dragons watched in what could only be described as shock. The hatchling reached Owen's boot, sniffed it thoroughly, then planted itself directly on top of his foot. It looked up at him with bright amber eyes and released another chirp, this one even more insistent than the first. Then it did something that made all the adult dragons freeze completely. The tiny creature spread its small wings as wide as they would go, arched its neck, and released a sound that was clearly meant to be threatening despite coming from something that could fit in Owen's backpack. The scar dragon made a sound like a strangled cough. The curious green one's eyes went wide. Several others exchanged looks that Owen could have sworn showed disbelief. The hatchling, apparently satisfied with its display, curled up on Owen's boot and tucked its head under one wing. A rumbling purr emanated from its small body. Owen stood perfectly still, afraid to move and disturb whatever had just happened. He didn't understand the significance, but clearly something important had occurred. The adult dragons were no longer looking at him with predatory interest. Instead, they seemed confused, frustrated, and in the case of the scarred one, absolutely furious. But none of them moved to attack. The curious green dragon edged closer, making soft clicking sounds. It examined the hatchling on Owen's boot, then looked at Owen's face, then back at the hatchling. It made another sound, almost like a question. Owen took a careful breath and spoke softly. "I don't suppose anyone wants to tell me what just happened." The dragons, of course, didn't respond to his words, but their body language shifted. The circle remained, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt more like a guard formation. The scarred dragon growled something that sounded like a command, and the others began to settle down around the clearing, though their attention never left Owen. The tiny hatchling on his boot continued to purr, completely unconcerned with the tension surrounding them. Owen looked down at the small creature that had apparently just changed his entire situation. It was clearly the runt, probably rejected by the others based on its malnourished appearance. "Well," Owen said quietly to the sleeping hatchling, "I don't know what you just did, little one, but thank you." The hatchling's purr grew louder, and Owen decided that whatever happened next, he wasn't going to let anything harm this tiny dragon that had inexplicably decided to claim him. 3 days passed, and Owen began to understand the strange rules that now govern his life. The adult dragons hadn't left. They maintained a constant presence around his camp, rotating through shifts like guards protecting something valuable. At first, Owen thought they were simply monitoring a potential threat, but their behavior told a different story. Whenever the tiny hatchling wandered more than a few feet from Owen, the adults would shift positions to maintain a protective perimeter around both of them. When Owen moved to gather firewood, 2 dragons would follow at a distance, watching the forest shadows. When he slept, at least 3 remained awake and alert throughout the night. They were protecting him. But why? The hatchling, whom Owen had started calling Pip because of her constant chirping, refused to leave his side for more than a few minutes at a time. She followed him everywhere, her small claws clicking on the metal pieces of salvage he had scattered around his camp. She watched everything he did with intense focus, as if memorizing his every action. Owen shared his emergency rations with her, noticing how thin she truly was. Her ribs showed through her scales, and her wings looked almost translucent in the sunlight. The other dragons never brought her food, he realized. She was being excluded from their hunts and meals. That changed when Owen started feeding her. Using his survival knife, he would cut his protein bars into small pieces and hand-feed them to Pip. She ate with desperate hunger at first, but after a few days, she began eating more slowly, as if finally believing the food would keep coming. The curious green dragon, whom Owen mentally named Beth because she reminded him of his gentle aunt, started watching these feeding sessions with particular interest. On the 4th day, Beth approached carrying something in her jaws. She dropped a freshly killed creature that looked like a cross between a rabbit and a lizard near Owen's shelter, then backed away. Owen looked at the offering, then at Beth, then at Pip. The hatchling chirped excitedly and began tearing into the meat with tiny jaws. Beth made a pleased rumbling sound and settled down to watch. "Thank you," Owen said, nodding to Beth. She tilted her head at his words, and he could have sworn she looked pleased. The scar dragon, the clear leader of this group, maintained its distance. Owen had started calling him Garth in his mind, after a grumpy drill sergeant he once knew. Garth never approached the camp directly, but Owen often caught the old dragon watching him with narrowed eyes, as if trying to solve a puzzle that irritated him. But on the 5th day, Owen woke to find Pip shivering violently. Her scales felt hot to the touch, and her breathing came in shallow gasps. The other dragons noticed, but showed no concern. Several glanced at the sick hatchling, then looked away as if she no longer existed. Owen felt cold anger rise in his chest. He carefully lifted Pip and brought her into his shelter, wrapping her in his emergency blanket. The survival pod's medical scanner was designed for humans, but he hoped it might give him some useful information about her condition. The scan showed elevated temperature and inflammation in her respiratory system, a fever and lung infection, if he was interpreting the alien readings correctly. Owen pulled out his medical kit and found the broad-spectrum antibiotics and fever reducers. He had no idea if human medicine would work on dragon biology, but doing nothing meant watching Pip die. He carefully administered a tiny dose of fever reducer, then used heated stones from his fire to create a warm bed for her. Throughout the day and into the night, he monitored her temperature, adjusted her bedding, and spoke to her constantly in soft tones. "You're going to be fine, little one," he told her, wiping her scales with a damp cloth. "I didn't survive a crash landing just to lose you to a fever." Beth watched from outside the shelter, her attention fixed on Owen's efforts. As night fell and Pip's condition worsened, Beth moved closer, settling just outside the entrance. Her presence felt protective, supportive even. Owen worked through the night, checking Pip's temperature every hour, adjusting medications, keeping her warm and hydrated. He told her stories about Earth to keep himself focused, describing oceans and mountains, cities and deserts. He didn't know if she understood, but her breathing seemed to ease when he talked. Dawn broke gray and cool. Owen checked Pip's temperature one more time and felt relief flood through him. The fever had broken. Her breathing had evened out, and color was returning to her scales. He slumped back against the shelter wall, exhausted. Beth's large head appeared in the entrance, her eyes moving from Pip to Owen and back again. She made a soft sound, almost like approval, then disappeared. An hour later, she returned carrying more fresh meat. This time, she didn't just drop it and leave. She pushed it all the way into the shelter, placing it within Owen's reach, then touched her snout gently to his shoulder before backing out. That IT was the first time any of the adult dragons had made physical contact with him. The gesture felt significant, though Owen didn't fully understand why. Over the next 2 days, more dragons began bringing offerings. Not just Beth, but others in the pack. Fresh kills, interesting stones, even branches with vibrant flowers. They would leave these gifts at the edge of his camp, then retreat to watch his reaction. Garth remained the lone holdout, keeping his distance and watching everything with those calculating eyes that on the 8th day, scouts returned with news that caused immediate agitation among the pack. Dragons took flight, circling overhead, making aggressive calls toward the mountains in the distance. Garth roared commands, and the pack began organizing themselves into formations. Owen watched the activity with growing concern. He had been a cargo pilot, not a soldier, but he had transported enough military personnel to recognize preparation for battle when he saw it. Something was coming, and the pack was getting ready to fight. Beth approached his shelter making urgent sounds, gesturing with her head toward a thick grove of trees. The message was clear: hide, but Owen looked at Pip, now recovered and chirping happily, and then at the dragons organizing their defense. They had protected him when they could have easily killed him. They had accepted him because of Pip's claim, whatever that meant. And now they were preparing to face some threat while telling him to run and hide. That he thought about the emergency beacon, still damaged and useless. No rescue was coming anytime soon. These dragons were the only reason he was still alive. More than that, they had become something like family over the past week. Owen stood up and walked toward Garth, ignoring Beth's alarmed chirp. The old dragon turned to face him, lowering its head to his level with a warning growl. Owen pointed to the mountains, then made a fighting gesture. He pointed to the dragons, then to himself and Pip. He drew in the dirt, using stones to represent dragons in formation. Then he began rearranging the stones, showing different positions, better tactical arrangements. Garth watched, his expression unreadable. But he didn't walk away. And when Owen finished his crude demonstration, the old dragon made a thoughtful rumbling sound and called Beth over to look. The mountain clan arrived at sunset, their shadows stretching long across the valley floor. Owen counted 12 adult dragons, each one larger and more scarred than the members of his pack. They moved with the confidence of creatures who had never known defeat, their scales bearing old wounds like badges of honor. Leading them was a dragon that made even Garth look small. This creature was ancient, its scales dark as storm clouds, its eyes cold and calculating. It landed with enough force to shake the ground, and when it spoke, the sound carried the weight of absolute authority. Owen's pack had assembled in defensive positions just as he had shown them. They maintained proper spacing, covered each other's flanks, and kept high ground advantage. But even with better positioning, they were outnumbered and outsized. Owen could see the tension in their postures, the way their wings held ready for sudden flight. Pip pressed against Owen's leg, her small body trembling. But she didn't hide behind him. Instead, she positioned herself between Owen and the approaching threat. Her tiny wings spread in what would have been a threatening display if she had been larger. The ancient dragon spoke again, and though Owen couldn't understand the words, the meaning was clear from tone and gesture. A demand. The mountain dragons wanted something, and they expected immediate compliance. Garth responded, his voice firm but measured. A refusal. The ancient dragon's eyes narrowed, scanning the assembled pack until they found what they were looking for. Owen felt the full weight of that predatory gaze settle on him. The creature took a step forward, and Owen's pack shifted in response, tightening their protective formation around him and Pip. More words were exchanged, the ancient dragon's tone growing harsh and mocking. It gestured toward Pip with one massive claw, and several of the mountain dragons made sounds that could only be laughter. They were mocking her size, her weakness, her very existence. Pip released a sound Owen had never heard from her before. It started as a chirp, but rose into something sharp and defiant. She launched herself forward, flapping her small wings to gain a few feet of height, placing herself directly in front of the massive ancient dragon. The clearing went silent. Even the mountain clan seemed shocked by the audacity of this tiny creature. The ancient dragon leaned down, bringing its enormous head level with Pip. It could have swallowed her in one bite. Instead, it made a sound that was clearly a question, almost amused by her bravery. Pip responded with another sharp cry, then did something that made Owen's heart stop. She lunged forward and snapped her tiny jaws at the ancient dragon's snout, actually making contact with its scales before bouncing backward. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the ancient dragon reared back and roared with what sounded like outrage. The battle was about to begin. Garth's pack executed their practiced maneuvers perfectly. 2 dragons swept in from the flanks, while 3 more created a defensive wall. The coordination caught the mountain clan off guard. They were used to individual combat, dragon against dragon, relying on size and strength to win. They weren't prepared for synchronized attacks and strategic positioning. Owen directed from the ground, using gestures he and the pack had practiced. Beth and 2 others executed a diving pattern that forced 3 mountain dragons to cluster together, limiting their mobility. Garth himself engaged the ancient dragon, not trying to win, but simply to occupy the larger creature's attention. The strategy was working. Mountain dragons stumbled over each other, got in each other's way, created openings that Owen's pack exploited ruthlessly. Within minutes, 2 of the larger dragons were grounded with injured wings, and a third had retreated to the tree line. But the ancient dragon was learning. It watched the patterns, noticed the coordination, and began calling commands to its own pack. The mountain clans started adapting, creating their own formations in response. The battle shifted. Owen's pack had surprise and strategy, but the mountain clan had experience and raw power. The fight became more even, more desperate. Dragons crashed together in midair, raking claws across scales, seeking any advantage. Then the ancient dragon did something unexpected. It broke away from Garth and turned its full attention toward Owen. The massive creature dove like a falling mountain, claws extended, jaws open. Owen had nowhere to run, no way to defend himself. He was about to die, and he knew it. Pip screamed. The sound was unlike anything Owen had heard, a cry of pure desperation and rage. She launched herself at the ancient dragon's face with complete disregard for her own survival. Her tiny claws found the dragon's left eye, and she clung there with all her strength, her small jaws snapping at the sensitive tissue. The ancient dragon roared in pain and shock, shaking its head violently to dislodge her. Garth made a split-second decision. He released a commanding roar that cut through the chaos of battle, and the entire pack responded instantly. They abandoned their individual fights and converged on the ancient dragon as one unified force. Beth hit first, slamming into the creature's shoulder with enough impact to throw off its balance. Two others grabbed its wings, forcing them down. Garth himself went for the throat, not to kill, but to control, to force submission. The Mountain Clan hesitated, caught between following their leader into a battle they were now losing or retreating to save themselves. The ancient dragon, pinned by 5 dragons working in perfect coordination, with a tiny hatchling still clinging fiercely to its face, finally understood that it had lost. It made a sound, harsh and reluctant, but unmistakable. Surrender. Garth held his position for a long moment, making sure the submission was genuine, then released his grip. The other dragons backed away slowly, maintaining defensive positions. Pip finally let go and dropped to the ground, landing near Owen's feet and immediately taking up her protective stance again. The ancient dragon rose slowly, blood trickling from its damaged eye. It looked at Pip, then at Owen, then at the organized pack that had just defeated a superior force through coordination and strategy. It made one final statement, something that sounded almost respectful, then turned and led its clan back toward the mountains as the mountain dragons disappeared into the distance. Owen's pack began checking each other for injuries. None were seriously hurt, though all bore new scratches and bruises. They had won their first real battle against the Mountain Clan, something Garth's scarred hide suggested had never happened before. Beth approached Owen and made a sound he had come to recognize as approval. Other dragons followed, touching their snouts to his hands or shoulders, acknowledging his role in their victory. Even Garth approached, though more slowly than the others. The old dragon studied Owen for a long moment, then lowered his massive head and touched his scarred snout to Owen's forehead. The gesture felt profound, like an acceptance he hadn't fully earned until this moment. Pip climbed up Owen's leg and perched on his shoulder, chirping triumphantly despite her exhaustion. Owen carefully stroked her small head, still processing everything that had just happened. "You're absolutely insane, you know that?" he told her quietly. "Brave, loyal, and completely insane." Pip's purse suggested she took this as a compliment. 2 weeks after the battle, Owen's camp had transformed into something more permanent. The dragons had helped him salvage more materials from the crashed pod, and he had constructed a proper shelter that could withstand the forest's frequent storms. His emergency beacon still blinked its useless red light, but he found himself checking it less often each day. Pip had grown noticeably larger and stronger. Proper nutrition and constant care had added muscle to her frame and shine to her scales. She still followed Owen everywhere, but now other hatchlings did too. Word had spread among the pack that the strange pale creature could heal sickness and shared his food freely. The young dragons would approach cautiously at first, watching from a distance until Pip chirped encouragement. Then they would edge closer, sniffing curiously at Owen's tools and supplies. He started setting aside portions of his diminishing rations for them, supplemented by the fresh meat the adult dragons now brought regularly. Beth had become his primary teacher in dragon language and customs. She would spend hours making sounds and gestures, patiently waiting for Owen to repeat them until he got the tone right. He learned that the sound Pip had made when she first claimed him translated roughly to mine or my responsibility, and that such claims were sacred bonds in dragon culture. No dragon could contest another's claim without risking clan war. That was why the pack had been forced to protect him despite Garth's initial hostility. Pip's declaration had bound them all to his safety. "She saved my life without even knowing it," Owen said to Beth one afternoon, watching Pip play with 2 other hatchlings. Beth made an agreeing rumble and settled down beside him. The peaceful routine was interrupted on the 16th day when the emergency beacon suddenly switched from red to green. Owen stared at it for a full minute, not quite believing what he was seeing. The internal systems had finally completed their self-repair cycle. A rescue signal was now broadcasting into space. Garth noticed Owen's reaction and approached, tilting his massive head to examine the small blinking device. Owen tried to explain using the dragon words he had learned, combined with gestures and drawings in the dirt. A ship would come. Other humans. They would take him back to human space. Garth made a thoughtful sound and called the pack together. What followed was clearly a council meeting, with each dragon voicing opinions about this new development. Owen couldn't follow all of it, but he caught enough to understand the debate. Some dragons seemed relieved that the strange human would finally leave. Others, particularly Beth and the younger dragons, appeared distressed by the news. Pip's reaction was the strongest. She planted herself on Owen's foot and refused to move, making increasingly distressed sounds. When Owen tried to explain that humans needed to be with other humans, she spread her wings and hissed at the very concept. That night, Owen lay awake in his shelter with Pip curled against his chest, her small body rising and falling with each breath. He thought about his life before the crash. Long-haul cargo flights between distant colonies, living in a cramped cabin, eating recycled meals, rarely speaking to anyone beyond basic communications protocols. He had been alone even when surrounded by humanity. Here, he had purpose. The dragons had started bringing him their sick and injured, trusting him to help. He had taught them tactics that had won them their first victory against a superior force. The hatchlings adored him, and even Garth showed him respect now. Beth pushed her head into the shelter, making a questioning sound. Owen sat up carefully, trying not to disturb Pip. "Can't sleep?" he told her. She made a sympathetic rumble and settled outside his door, a warm presence in the darkness. The rescue ship arrived 12 days later, a sleek human transport that set down in the clearing with professional precision. Owen walked out to meet it, very aware of the 7 adult dragons and a dozen hatchlings arranged protectively around him. The ship's captain emerged, a woman named Rodriguez who looked both impressed and nervous at the sight of so many large predators in close proximity to her vessel. She kept one hand near her sidearm as she approached Owen. "Owen Shun," she called out, "we received your emergency beacon. Are you injured? Are those creatures hostile?" "I'm fine, Captain," Owen replied. "And no, they're not hostile. They're friends." Rodriguez's eyebrows rose at that statement. "Friends, right? Well, gather your things. We could be back in civilized space within 3 days." Owen looked at the ship, then at the dragons, then at Pip who was pressed against his leg and trembling. 3 days back to civilization. Back to empty cargo runs and solitary meals. Back to a life where nobody needed him and he needed nobody. "Captain Rodriguez," he said slowly, "I need to ask you something. What's the policy on voluntary colonization of uncharted worlds?" The captain blinked. "You want to stay here? With the dragons?" "I want to establish first contact and a potential trade outpost," Owen clarified. "These dragons are intelligent, organized, and interested in peaceful interaction with humans. This could be the beginning of a beneficial relationship between our species." Rodriguez looked skeptical. "You're a cargo pilot, not a diplomat or xenobiologist." "I'm a cargo pilot who speaks their language and has their trust," Owen countered. "How many other humans can say that?" The captain studied him for a long moment, then glanced at the dragons, watching their conversation with obvious interest. "This is highly irregular. I'll need to contact the Colonial Administration." "Of course. In the meantime, could your ship systems take a look at my pod's medical scanner? I've been using it on dragon physiology, and some proper analysis of the data might be valuable." 2 days of negotiations followed. Owen used the ship's communication array to speak with Colonial Administration officials who were initially dismissive, but became increasingly interested as he demonstrated his ability to communicate with the dragons and shared his medical data on their biology. Garth and Beth participated in these negotiations, allowing themselves to be recorded and studied. They demonstrated their intelligence through complex problem-solving tasks Owen had designed, proving they were sapient beings capable of forming treaties and agreements. The officials finally agreed. Owen would remain as humanity's first official contact with the dragon species. The Colonial Administration would send proper supplies and personnel within 6 months to establish a formal outpost. Until then, Owen would maintain the relationship and continue gathering data. Rodriguez prepared to depart, shaking her head at what she clearly considered insanity. "You're sure about this, Chen?" 6 months alone on an alien world with a pack of dragons. Owen looked at Pip, now perched on his shoulder and chirping excitedly. He looked at Beth, who had patiently taught him her language. He looked at Garth, who had gone from wanting to kill him to treating him as an equal. "I'm not alone, Captain," he said simply. "I'm exactly where I belong." As the ship lifted off, the pack gathered around Owen. Pip climbed to his shoulder and nuzzled his cheek, making happy sounds. The other hatchlings swarmed around his legs, and even Garth made a satisfied rumble. Owen smiled and settled down in the clearing, surrounded by dragons, and felt more at home than he ever had among his own species. 3 months into his new role as humanity's dragon ambassador, Owen had learned more about the planet's ecosystem than any human had a right to know. The forest surrounding his camp was home to dozens of species, many of which the dragons hunted for food. The bioluminescent trees he had noticed on his first day actually responded to dragon calls, growing brighter when the pack returned from successful hunts. Pip had nearly doubled in size, though she remained smaller than her siblings. She could fly now, really fly, not just the clumsy hops she had managed before. Owen watched her soar above the canopy with a mixture of pride and melancholy. She was becoming what she was meant to be, a proper dragon, and soon she might not need him anymore. But every evening she returned to curl up next to him, and every morning she was the first to greet him. Some bonds, Owen realized, went deeper than simple necessity. The pack's territory had expanded since the battle with the Mountain Clan. Other dragon groups had heard about Garth's victory and the strange tactics employed by the human. Several had sent representatives to observe, and a few younger dragons from distant clans had asked to join the pack specifically to learn from Owen. Garth had surprised everyone by agreeing. The pack now numbered 15 adult dragons, and Owen found himself teaching basic military strategy to creatures who could tear him apart without effort. They learned quickly, adapting his human concepts to their aerial capabilities and creating maneuvers he never could have imagined. Beth had become his official liaison with other clans. She would fly out to meet with their leaders, explain the alliance with humans, and invite them to visit the outpost. Most were skeptical at first, but seeing Owen work alongside the pack usually convinced them that cooperation was possible. On the 94th day, something unexpected happened. A dragon arrived alone, flying hard and low, obviously exhausted. It crashed more than landed in the clearing, and Owen immediately recognized the dark scales despite the new wounds covering its body. The ancient dragon from the Mountain Clan had returned. But this time it came seeking help, not conflict. Garth and the pack surrounded the injured dragon instantly, ready to fight if this was some kind of trick. But the ancient one made no aggressive moves. It simply lay there, breathing heavily, and made sounds that Owen had learned meant submission and request for aid. Owen approached cautiously while Pip took up a protective position. The ancient dragon's wounded eye, the one Pip had damaged in battle, had become infected. The tissue around it was swollen and discolored, clearly causing immense pain. "Garth?" Owen called. "I need to examine the injury. Can you ask if it will allow me to approach?" Garth made a series of sounds, and the ancient dragon responded with a weak affirmative. Owen moved closer, studying the infection with his medical scanner. It was bad, possibly fatal if left untreated. The dragon's pride had likely prevented it from seeking help until the pain became unbearable. "I can treat this," Owen said, more to himself than anyone else. "But it's going to hurt, and you're going to have to trust me." He retrieved his medical supplies and began working. The ancient dragon flinched at first, but held still as Owen cleaned the wound and applied antibiotics. The pack watched in silence as their former enemy submitted to treatment from the tiny human it had tried to kill months before. The process took hours. Owen had to drain the infection, apply medications he hoped would work on dragon biology, and create a bandage from salvaged materials that would stay in place on the dragon's massive head. Through it all, the ancient dragon endured without complaint. When Owen finally finished, he was exhausted. The ancient dragon slowly lifted its head and looked at him with its remaining good eye. It made a sound, soft and respectful, then touched its snout gently to Owen's hand. Garth approached and made a formal declaration. Owen didn't catch all of it, but Beth translated the important parts. The Mountain Clan was requesting alliance. They had seen Owen spare their leader when he could have let infection take its course. Such mercy deserved respect and reciprocation. The dragon territories were unifying under a common banner, something that had never happened in their recorded history. And it was all because a cargo pilot had crashed in the wrong place, and a tiny hatchling had decided he was worth protecting. Over the following weeks, the ancient dragon recovered under Owen's care. Its name, Owen learned, was roughly translated as Stormwalker, and it had led the Mountain Clan for over 60 years. Stormwalker began teaching Owen about dragon history and culture, filling in details that Garth's pack either didn't know or hadn't thought to share. Dragons had once been spacefaring, Stormwalker revealed through combinations of sounds, gestures, and crew drawings. Thousands of years ago, they had traveled between stars, building and exploring. But some catastrophe had stranded their ancestors on this world, and over generations, the knowledge of their technological past had faded into myth. That's why you understood tactics so quickly, Owen realized. Somewhere deep in your cultural memory, you remember warfare on a larger scale. Stormwalker made an affirming rumble. The dragons hadn't lost their intelligence, just their tools and infrastructure. They had regressed to a more primitive state, but retained the capacity for greater things. News of the alliance spread quickly. Dragons from across the continent began arriving to see the human and his tiny protector. Some came seeking medical treatment, others to learn tactics, and many simply out of curiosity. Owen's small camp became a gathering place, a neutral ground where different clans could meet without the usual territorial tensions. The colonial administration supply ship arrived right on schedule, bringing proper medical equipment, building materials, and 3 additional human personnel. A xenobiologist named Dr. Sarah Kim, an engineer named Rick Santos, and a diplomat named Ambassador Liu. They were professional and enthusiastic, but Owen noticed how they maintained careful distance from the dragons at first. They saw impressive alien creatures worthy of study. Owen saw Beth's gentle patience, Garth's strategic mind, Stormwalker's wisdom, and Pip's fierce loyalty. They're not research subjects, Owen told Dr. Kim during their first meeting. They're partners. If we're going to make this work, you need to understand that. Dr. Kim looked at Pip, who was currently sprawled across Owen's shoulders like a scaly scarf, and smiled. I think I'm beginning to see what you mean. The outpost grew steadily. Dragons helped clear land and move materials, working alongside humans in an exchange of labor and knowledge. Stormwalker supervised the construction, suggesting modifications based on ancient dragon architecture that made the buildings more stable and efficient. Pip had taken it upon herself to greet every new arrival, both dragon and human. She would puff up her chest, spread her wings, and make important-sounding chirps as if explaining the rules of the outpost. Most visitors found this adorable, though Owen suspected Pip believed she was being quite intimidating. 6 months became a year. The outpost had proper facilities now, including a medical center where Owen and Dr. Kim treated both species, a workshop where Rick Santos helped dragons rediscover metalworking techniques, and a council chamber where Ambassador Liu facilitated discussions between human and dragon interests. Owen stood on a hill overlooking the settlement one evening, watching dragons and humans work together to build something new. Pip sat beside him, now nearly the size of a large dog, though still smaller than her siblings. You know, Owen said to her, I never thanked you properly for claiming me that first day. Pip chirped and bumped her head against his arm, a gesture that had become her way of saying she was happy. I was lost before I crashed here, Owen continued. Just going through the motions, not really living. You gave me purpose. You gave me family. Pip made a satisfied sound and curled closer. Below them, Beth was demonstrating flight techniques to a group of young human pilots who were learning to navigate the skies in small aircraft. Garth was locked in serious discussion with Ambassador Liu about trade routes. Stormwalker was teaching human engineers about ancient dragon metallurgy, that IT wasn't perfect. There were still misunderstandings, cultural clashes, and moments of tension. But they were building something together, humans and dragons, creating a future neither species could achieve alone. And it had all started because the smallest dragon in the pack had decided that one lost human was worth protecting. The 2-year anniversary of Owen's crash landing arrived with little fanfare. The outpost had grown into a proper settlement now, home to 43 humans and representatives from 9 different dragon clans. What had started as a survival camp had become the foundation of interspecies cooperation that neither humans nor dragons had thought possible. Owen walked through the settlement's main plaza, nodding greetings to both species as they went about their daily business. A human merchant was negotiating with a dragon artisan over the price of metalwork. 3 dragon hatchlings were playing tag with human children in the designated recreation area, supervised by parents from both species. Dr. Kim was conducting a joint medical seminar, teaching dragons human anatomy while learning dragon physiology in return that IT felt normal now, this blending of 2 civilizations. But Owen remembered when every interaction had required careful negotiation and mutual trust that neither side was entirely sure they possessed. Pip walked beside him, now fully grown and nearly as large as Beth. She still stayed close to Owen whenever possible, though she had her own responsibilities these days. She served as a liaison between the youngest members of both species, translating not just language but cultural concepts that adults sometimes struggled to explain. Morning Patrol is reporting something unusual, Rick Santos called out from the communications center. Multiple dragon flights incoming from the east. Big group, maybe 20 individuals. Owen felt his stomach tighten. The Eastern Territories belonged to clans that had refused alliance, maintaining traditional isolation. 20 dragons arriving together meant either an embassy or an invasion. Garth and Stormwalker were already moving toward the landing fields, organizing defensive positions just in case. Owen hurried to join them with Pip at his side. The incoming dragons circled the settlement twice before landing, a show of strength that wasn't lost on anyone watching. Their leader was a dragon Owen had never seen before, with scales that shimmered like copper in the sunlight and eyes that held keen intelligence. The copper dragon spoke formally, its words carrying across the plaza. Beth translated quietly for Owen. The Sunrise clans send greetings. We come to observe what has been built here and determine if alliance serves our interests. They've been watching us for months, Stormwalker rumbled, waiting to see if this cooperation would last or fall apart. Now, they want to join. Garth made a welcoming gesture and invited the copper dragon to tour the settlement. Owen fell in step with the group, noting how the visiting dragons examined everything with critical eyes. They were looking for weakness, for signs that the alliance was forced or false. They found neither. Instead, they saw human engineers working alongside dragon craftsmen to build structures that incorporated the best of both species' knowledge. They saw medical facilities where doctors treated both humans and dragons with equal care. They saw children of both species learning together, playing together, growing up seeing cooperation as normal rather than exceptional. The copper dragon stopped at the memorial garden Owen had established. Simple stones marked the graves of 3 dragons and 2 humans who had died in accidents over the past 2 years. Both species mourned together here, honoring losses equally regardless of which form they had taken. You bury your dead together, the copper dragon observed. Share the same sacred ground. We live together, Owen replied through Beth's translation. Why would we not honor our dead together? The copper dragon made a thoughtful sound and moved on. The tour continued for hours, covering every aspect of settlement life. The visiting dragons asked pointed questions about resource distribution, decision-making processes, and conflict resolution. They weren't hostile, but they weren't easily convinced either. That evening, the settlement held a demonstration of coordinated flight tactics. Dragon and human pilots flew together in formations that would have been impossible for either species alone. Humans provided strategic thinking and precision timing, while dragons contributed power and aerial maneuverability. The copper dragon watched with growing interest. Your warriors move as one mind. We have never achieved such unity in battle. Because you still think of yourselves as individual clans competing for resources, Garth responded. We learned to think as one community sharing prosperity. A feast followed the demonstration, with both species contributing food and customs to the celebration. The visiting dragons initially held back, uncertain about accepting human hospitality. But when they saw Pip and the other young dragons enthusiastically sharing meals with human friends, old barriers began to crack. Owen found himself sitting next to the copper dragon as the celebration continued. Through a combination of learned dragon speech and best translation, they talked about the future. "Your species has technology we cannot match," the copper dragon said. "Are you not concerned that we will become dependent? That dragons will lose their identity?" "That works both ways," Owen replied. "Humans have technology, but you have capabilities we can never possess naturally. You can fly, you're stronger, you understand this world in ways we're still learning. True alliance means both species remain distinct while choosing to work together. And if we disagree, if our interests conflict, then we talk, we negotiate, we find compromise." Owen gestured to the plaza, where both species mingled freely. "Look around you. We're not the same, and we don't pretend to be. But we've learned that our differences make us stronger together than either species could be apart." The copper dragon was silent for a long moment, watching a human child teaching a young dragon how to use a communication tablet, while the dragon demonstrated proper wing grooming techniques. "You truly believe this can last? That old instincts and ancient fears won't eventually tear it apart?" "I believe we have to try," Owen said. "And I believe the next generation, the ones growing up seeing this as normal, won't have the same fears we do." Pip chose that moment to bound over, followed by 3 human teenagers and 2 dragon adolescents. They were arguing enthusiastically about the best strategy for an upcoming sporting match between mixed teams. The debate involved lots of gesturing, laughter, and friendly insults in both languages. "This is normal for them," Owen explained. "They don't see barriers between species because they've never known a world where those barriers defined everything." The copper dragon watched the young ones depart, still arguing cheerfully. "Perhaps you were right. Perhaps the future belongs to those too young to remember the old divisions." Over the next 3 days, the Sunrise clans integrated into settlement life, experiencing firsthand what alliance meant in practice. They worked alongside humans in the workshops, trained with Garth's tactical units, and attended Dr. Kim's medical lectures. More importantly, they talked with everyone, from the oldest veterans to the youngest hatchlings, hearing dozens of perspectives on what interspecies cooperation meant on the 4th day. The Copper Dragon made a formal declaration. The Sunrise clans would join the alliance, bringing their territories and resources into the growing network of cooperation. They requested human assistance in establishing their own joint settlements and offered to share knowledge of mineral deposits that human technology could help mine efficiently. Ambassador Liu handled the formal negotiations, but afterward, the Copper Dragon approached Owen privately. "I understand now why the others followed you. A human who crashed alone and survived by earning the trust of creatures who could have killed him. A cargo pilot who became a bridge between worlds. You showed everyone that cooperation was possible." "I had help," Owen said, reaching up to stroke Pip's neck as she settled beside him. "None of this would have worked without her deciding I was worth protecting." The Copper Dragon looked at Pip with new appreciation. The smallest one who started everything. "There's poetry in that." Pip chirped proudly, and Owen laughed. "Don't encourage her. She's already convinced she's the most important dragon in the Alliance." "Perhaps she is," the Copper Dragon said seriously. "Without her claim, you would have died. Without you, humans and dragons would never have learned to work together. The smallest action can redirect the course of history." After the Sunrise clans departed, taking with them plans and agreements for future cooperation, Owen stood once again on his favorite hill overlooking the settlement. 2 years since the crash. 2 years since a tiny sick hatchling had decided he belonged to her. The settlement below was larger now, more permanent, with proper buildings and infrastructure. But it was the activity that mattered most. Dragons and humans moving together, working together, living together in harmony that neither species had thought achievable. Beth joined him on the hill, settling down with the comfortable familiarity of old friends. Storm Walker says more clans will arrive next month. Word spreads quickly now that the Sunrise clans have joined. Good, Owen said. The more who join, the stronger we all become. Do you ever regret staying? Beth asked. Your rescue ship could have taken you back to your own kind. You chose to remain here instead. Owen thought about his old life, the endless cargo runs, the solitude, the feeling of just existing rather than truly living. Then he looked at the settlement, at Pip practicing aerial maneuvers with young pilots, at the future being built by two species learning to trust each other. Not once, he said firmly. I was lost before I crashed here. Pip found me, claimed me, and gave me a purpose I never knew I needed. This is home now. These are my people, both human and dragon. Pip landed beside them, slightly out of breath from her practice session. She settled between Owen and Beth, creating a bridge between human and dragon quite literally. She chirped contentedly, and Owen realized that sound had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Below them, the settlement continued its evening routine. Lights came on in human buildings while dragons settled into their communal resting areas. Children of both species were called home by concerned parents. Guard from both species began their night watch patrols, protecting everyone equally. This was the future Owen had helped build. Not a human future or a dragon future, but a shared future where both species contributed their strengths and supported each other's weaknesses. And it had all started because one tiny dragon had looked at a crash human and decided, with the absolute certainty only the young possess, that he belonged to her. She had been right. Owen belonged here, with Pip, with the pack, with this strange, beautiful community that never should have existed, but somehow did. Come on, Owen said, standing up. Let's go home. Pip chirped agreement, and together with Beth, they made their way down the hill toward the settlement. Toward home, toward a future that promised to be extraordinary precisely because it was built on the simple truth that sometimes the smallest acts of protection can change entire worlds.